Hello, in this topic we're going to look at the functional setup manager. So it's an overview to the place that implementers, in terms of business specialists, would come in and configure the system. So in the cloud, the module for all of the configuration and in the tax, whether that's regime to rates, whether it's various fiscal classifications, etc. One-stop shop is this functional setup manager. And if we look on this right-hand side, you'll see we've got this option. So my functional setup managers would decide perhaps what we're implementing. We've got this concept of opting in and opting out. A lot of, say, localizations or very specific information, if it's not going to be relevant to me, I can opt out of that, and that will minimize the number of tasks I see either in my functional plan or in the older implementation plan. Setup, that will be a whole list of tasks, and we've got a predefined list that optimize them in the correct order. We deploy, we might have a maintenance project, so particularly in tax, if we need to be more flexible, changing the status and rates as the various tax rules are changed because of various government regulations or the tax authority interpretations, then we need to go back in and keep on modifying those, and we might create perhaps a specific project to do the modification. We might use a functional plan to do it in step. So the first place, any configuration is done from functional setup manager. And in the tax, there's extensive use if we can load this via the use of rapid spreadsheets. So you can define the whole regime, the taxes, the subscription, the whole tax in the workbook via rapid spreadsheets. So in a little bit more detail, FSM, Functional Setup Manager, you'll see we've got in terms of various 6, if you like, setup points. So priority 1 for the implementers, centralized setup. So if you knew nothing about the cloud, come in, you can look at all the offerings. So here we've got a nice graphical icon of all the offerings. In terms of financials, in effect, anything to do with the subledger and tax is the financial offering is the one we're after. The financial accounting hub one is implementing the accounting engine, GL, and the new, if you like, flexibility or choice of financial reporting tools. That is normally not where you would do tax. You would implement one of the Oracle subledgers, receivables, payables, etc. And that's where you would come across the need to set up either transactional tax or withholding tax. The beauty of it is that you've got a predefined list. So in the functional area, this is split between required and optional. In the older implementation projects, then you can set up in terms of you get a predefined task list and you can edit that if you wish. The implementation projects are configurable. Also, the functional area is configurable by this concept of opting in and opting out. And as we go through the rapid releases of the cloud, in terms of releases, A, B, C, D, product release during the year, then you'll find if there's specific new functionality introduced, you can decide to opt in and opt out. Some of them, if you opt in, you require additional configuration. Others, if you opt in, there's no further configuration. You don't guess the dependencies. The dependencies and the correct order of the build is built in. A comprehensive set of reports as you go through your configuration. And this is the bit that really I find very, very exciting and very, very, in terms of usable, is if I've done all this in my test instance and I want to move my objects and my setup objects from test to prod or from prod to golden in terms of instance, then there's this concept to export and import. And in early releases, it was sort of the whole project or nothing. Very, very quickly, you've got this, you can do it per functional area. So if the only thing you wanted to move between, say, my test and prod or prod back to a play pit in terms of database instance, was you can use the export and import. So it creates a configuration package, and in that configuration package you can decide what you move from the different instances. One-stop shop to do everything is your functional setup manager. So in terms of the setup manager, it starts with the offerings, and this is normally tied into a business process. So if we're going to configure any of the Oracle subledgers, so AR, AP, etc. Then tax or transactional tax setup is part of that. In the functional areas, you normally opt in and opt out, and that will decide what predefined list of tasks you see either in the functional area or on a project. And in the initial project, you normally have sort of yes or no options, but increasingly with these rapid patches that you see ABC for a year, you have the options where you'll see opt in and opt out. And if you've opted in and opt out, that will add tasks perhaps, and you'll have a history of those tasks of when you opted in and whether you completed the setup of those opt-in features. So this just shows you from my navigator, then a couple of ways I can get to Functional Setup Manager. I can search for it as the navigator, I can have it in my favorites, or under the user, then I can go to Setup and Functional Area. Once I'm there, I pick the offering up here. So in most of the tax configuration, to get there, it would always be financials, and you'll be looking down here for something that says transaction tax. Here we're looking at legal structure, and that then shows us the offerings under the legal structure. In terms of sometime, you might see scope. So here we've got configuration that can be repeated per business object. So in this case, we've got ledger options per ledger. So if I've got a US ledger, a UK ledger, an Ireland ledger, then I need to repeat the setup. So I have to tell the system what object I'm interested in, hence the scope. And here you'll see quite an extensive configuration already in Vision. And here they're selecting that my focus of attention is the Australian in terms of ledger. Once I've selected scope, then you'll tend to find you have various tasks. And in terms of tax, it can be simplified really with our core tax setup and then advanced tax setup. And you'll find in the latest implementation projects that what you'll have core setup, core tax setup, regime to rate with product exceptions and customer exemptions, or you'll have in terms of advanced options where you'll be looking at determining factors, condition set, various rules in the system. If you get completely lost in the UI, unlikely, but if you do, two ways. In the task panel, remember there's a search. So as long as you know that I want to go somewhere, if I want to go to manage party fiscal classifications, can't find it, if you just search that in, you can use the wildcards, that will get a particular task. At the top of the project, you also have a search with all the tasks within that particular offering. But if you're struggling with the navigation, task panel search, and that's your one-stop shop to find everything across all offerings. In this task, you're going to look at Functional Setup Manager, you're going to look at some offerings, and you're going to explore the particular tax setup tasks. So before we get to that, let me just, in terms of expand your practice a little bit more. So what I'm going to do is move across to the application. And I'm going to go and find Functional Setup Manager. So from my settings and action, so I could have gone Navigator, Tools and Setup and Maintenance, but I haven't. I've gone in terms of my setting and actions of all the offerings here. So if I go to Action and see Go to Offerings, shows us all the offerings and this extensive use. If you click on here and expand, you'll see you've got an extensive use of all the documentation, a full configuration of the setup tasks, the objects, and you've got the opt-in and opt-out type features. And if I come down, notice on here, going to be in financials. If I click on transactional tax, core, there's only 3 tasks. And again, you'd have to select scope. So I've already focused the selection of scope here that I'm interested in the GB VAT tax. And if I expand that, you'll see I've got a list of all tasks. And in earlier exercise, I navigated to look at the simulated transaction. Now that using the functional setup is the preferred route or considered best practice. If I look at the older set a configuration. Here I'm going to create, if you like, my own tax only project. So let's call this O2 tax project. And if I tab, then code should come in. And normally you would just select an offering, but I'm not going to do any of that. I'm just going to open up an empty project. And the reason I'm opening an empty project is perhaps I'm really a tax administrator, so I'm not interested in configuring ARAP or intercompany. I want to just focus on tax. So in the action, and I'm switching down here to the task list, and obviously I'm going to use the wildcards, and I'm going to just look for everything with tax. So here I've got a global configuration called define tax configuration. So I've added that. I also want to add in this concept of, if I was needed to do it quickly, I could have a rapid implementation which would have a different set of task lists. And this rapid implementation, so on this another task list option, I'm looking here for taxes for rapid implementation, and that normally is the extensive use of spreadsheets. So you'll find there's less tasks. So in a full configuration where we might look at everything, you'll see I've got a tax configuration, and in terms of including the core setup, and then what we're going to cover in later chapters, which referred to as advanced tax configuration, when we're looking at tax exemptions on customer or product or combination. We've got fiscal classifications, party, product, transactions, and the use in the various tax rules. And if I collapse my configuration there and we look at rapid implementation, you'll notice the rapid implementation, not as many tasks here, and is very much fine-tuned for the use of spreadsheets. So if I go to the tasks here, you'll find a particular task window opens up, and in the banner or the header after the search, you'll find I've got the ability to pull down all of these tax books that will aid me with my rapid implementation. You'll find the final slide just shows you where you can get more assistance. So extensive use of videos. So docs.oracle.com, look at the videos. You'll find there's common, where you look at reviewing options, opting in and out of new features, selecting new features, having a look at the scope selection that will influence the number of tasks in your functional area or in a specialized project. And if you're more technical and need to export and import that between different database instances, then have a look at those demos there provided within the docs.oracle.com. So that concludes this review of the Functional Setup Manager.